The movie begins in 1917 in Houston, Texas. In response to the ongoing racial discrimination, the 24th Infantry, led by First Sergeant Hayes, is assigned to help guard the construction of Camp Logan. As the men begin their work in the field, they start talking about their future in the Army. However, the tension breaks out when Private Walker questions Private William Boston, one of the other soldiers. Walker then challenges Boston's intentions in joining the Army and calls out Boston's history in France. The following day, as Boston and his colleague, Big Joe, patrol around the area, they catch one of the white workers urinating on their fellow soldier, Private Cleater Lucky. As they rush to help him, the workers mock them with racist insults. Later that night, Boston and his friends hop on a trolley on their way back to camp. He subtly notices that the trolley splits into two divisions, one for white people and another for black people. As his group squeezes into the trolley division, Walker arrives. Despite seeing the division's signage, Walker sits on the white-only division and quickly gets into an argument with the motorman. When he stubbornly refuses to move, two white policemen cross and Evans get involved. After asking the citizens to get off the trolley, they physically beat him and threatened Boston and his group. The commanding commander, Norton, reviews Boston's transcripts from his studies in France the next day and suggests that he be sent to Iowa for colored commander training. Boston, however, turns down the offer, stating that he would want to remain in Texas and work for his country with his people. Norton accepts his choice, moves on, and inquires about Walker's earlier evening encounter. He makes it plain to him that for the duration of their stay in Texas, the 24th Infantry is required to abide by the racial code. Tommy Lee, a white worker, stops Boston later in the day when he takes a sip of water for the soldiers. When two other black soldiers get involved, Lee and the rest of the workers insult the Negroes. After throwing a bunch of death threats, they walk back to their shed. During the evening, Boston joins a party exclusively for Negroes. However, when he greets Hayes, the sergeant pulls him aside. Hayes brings up his suspicion about Boston's intentions and criticizes his character. When Boston leaves, Hayes and another sergeant, Clinton, compare Boston to Fagan, a soldier who deserted their army in the past. As Boston roams around the party, he meets Mary Downing, a talented female pianist. Unfortunately, her beautiful playing gets cut short when the party's band ignores her away. Boston, struck by her personality and beauty, offers her a dance. However, Downing sheepishly tells Boston that she has to go home when the people start murmuring about them. Having offered to walk her home, Boston learns about Downing's migration wishes and opens up about her parents' death. However, before he can ask more questions about her personal life, she cuts the conversation short when she points out her house. After thanking him for the walk, she introduces herself and walks away to her home. Norton calls Boston and a few other men to his tent the next day. He assures them they won't have any more problems with the Houston police. Then he announces that Boston will be the 24th Infantry's new corporal. After receiving much criticism from Hayes, Boston gets pulled aside by Norton. Boston wastes no time and brings up his issue about the mistreatment his men experience from the police. Norton tells him that he will shield the men from danger as long as they uphold the peace, while also reminding him of his responsibility to maintain discipline within the 24th Infantry. Boston confronts Hayes about his unwaveringly chilly demeanor later that day. With a sneer, Hayes remembers how he once escorted black soldiers and Teddy Roosevelt. He makes the point that they mistreated him and his soldiers and didn't get acknowledged for their help. Boston may be full of hope for justice, but Hayes says sourly that black people in the United States will never be treated with dignity. Boston brings flowers to Downing's house that evening. However, he gets taken aback by seeing Walker in Downing's home. The following day, Walker provokes him, telling him she's his whore. A fight quickly follows, with Boston throwing hit after hit and separated by Captain Abner Lockhart. Consequently, the captain ties them to two poles and uses a sack of grapefruit to beat them. Later, when Norton learns about the fight, he lectures Boston and reiterates that he has to ensure that his men are in order. When Boston leaves, Lockhart insults the black soldiers, telling Norton they're inferior and shouldn't be treated as men. Seeing the captain's disgusting perspective, Norton defends the 24th Infantry. He threatens to strip Lockhart of his ranks if he again displays inhumane treatment towards the soldiers. Not long after, news reaches Boston that a black civilian was stabbed by Tommy Lee. Boston swiftly disarms Lee and places the knife at his throat as soon as he gets to the scene. Boston threatens the employees to leave or risk not getting paid after noticing that his coworkers have left him alone and walked away. Lee is driven to the police station by Boston and a few other men after the laborers surrender their weapons. Chief Carter Hammond orders Lee to be arrested after receiving an explanation from Lee. Present the entire time, Cross and Evans challenge Hammond's directives, asking why they should arrest a white man. Then, Hammond angrily repeats the order, leading to Lee's imprisonment. Back at camp, Boston yells at Norton for having to have witnessed the death of one of his people and angrily asks for sidearms to protect themselves. However, Norton declines, explaining that Hammond will not allow it. Then he comes out of the tent to see the 24th Infantry praising him. Norton explains to Boston that he's the first black man ever to arrest a white citizen. Later in the evening, Walker goes into Boston's tent. Unable to believe his intent to fight for their race, he asks why he risked his life to arrest Lee. Boston makes it clear that despite his history of studying in Paris, he still faces discrimination like the rest of his men. Hearing his past, Walker makes amends and accepts him, clarifies that Downing was never his whore, and then leaves. The following day, Boston and Downing spend the day together. Throughout their date, they get to know each other more. As Downing realizes Boston's admirable goal of serving as their racial representative in the army, she eventually starts to feel sorry for him. Norton meets his brother Ben the following day. He informs Norton of his father's passing, advises that Norton leave Texas, and extends an offer for him to command the military in France. Norton first declines, preferring to stay and command the troops of color. Ben clarifies that Norton must take the lead in France in order to honor their father. Norton ultimately decides on France and informs the guys that Lockhart will take over as their new CO. Boston confronts him after the meeting and warns him that Lockhart will mistreat the black soldiers in his new capacity. Despite his attempts to assure Boston that all will be well, he adds that Boston should rethink going to Iowa for training. When Boston refuses, he dryly wishes the soldier well and leaves. Seeking comfort, Boston goes to Downing's home and explains the officer training offer they gave him. Downing replies, telling him about the sexual abuse and discrimination she went through in the past. She points out that going to Iowa won't make him any less of a soldier and encourages him to take the offer. In the end, they both agree to go to Iowa together. When he informs Hayes of his decision, the sergeant mocks him. Hayes discourages him by telling him he's turning his back on his people by leaving them for Iowa. However, the conversation turns when he attacks Hayes' position, telling him that he made a difference by arresting Lee. Hayes scoffs in mockery, explaining that they released Lee without charges. The next day, Evans and Cross fight with Davids when they harass a black woman in town. When Boston finds out Davids is in jail, he confronts Evans and Cross. A fight quickly escalates when Evans and Cross chase Boston into town. Back at camp, Big Joe informs the infantry that Boston is dead. Furious, Hayes and the men quickly prepare their weapons, ready to wage war against the police. However, when Lockhart sees the mutiny, he orders them to stand down. When Hayes refuses, Lockhart threatens to get him demoted and court-martialed. Hayes seethes with anger as he grudgingly calls his men to put away their weapons. When Lockhart goes into town, he discovers that Boston is alive. Despite Boston's bruised face, Lockhart orders him to lie and explains that Boston must not say anything to maintain order among the men. However, despite Lockhart's attempt at lying to the men, the soldiers begin to clamor about the mistreatment they've experienced from the police. Soon afterward, there is a soldier mutiny. Lockhart learns that a white mob is on its way when he observes the soldiers' agitated mood. The army are getting ready to storm the town once more while he searches for the group. The soldiers start firing down the police officers as they move through the town in formation. When Boston witnesses his fellow troops attacking civilians, he is horrified. They spot an oncoming automobile as they continue to stroll through the town. Boston stops the men in order to identify the drivers, since he cannot bear to witness another heinous massacre. When he sees their civilians, he safely lets them pass through the angry group of soldiers. Despite his efforts to rationalize with the soldiers to stop killing civilians, the men release fire when they see another vehicle approaching. However, a sea of dread suddenly washes over them when they know they have just killed a captain from the army. Walking back to camp, the soldiers contemplate what to do about the anarchy. On their way back, Hayes hands a gun to Clinton, implying to shoot him. Looking back at the insurgents he led, he explains that there's no more honor for him as a soldier. However, he places the task on Boston's shoulders when Clinton refuses to shoot him. After saluting his men with one last handshake and leaving Boston and Hayes behind, he admits that he won't shoot Hayes. Then Boston tells him he doesn't need to commit suicide. However, Hayes shares his passion for being in the army and explains that he'd rather die this way rather than get killed by the white men. He admits to Boston that he'd always been scared of the Americans and salutes Boston's genuine nobility. A second later, Hayes pulls the trigger on himself, leaving Boston stunned. The next day, the infantry is swiftly apprehended after being besieged in the woodland. Crying, Downing flees to Boston as the soldiers make their way out of the town, but Boston angrily yells for the white soldier to leave her alone when he slaps her with a gun. Norton meets with Boston 3 months later and severely advises that Boston identify the anarchy's leaders in order to obtain court immunity. However, Boston graciously declines, telling him that he would prefer to die in order to stand with his fellow countrymen. He then talks about how passionate he is about upholding his race's integrity. Seeing Boston's zealous decision to choose sacrifice over self-preservation, Norton salutes the soldier one last time with a handshake. During the court-martial, Boston and his men discover that Lucky, one of the soldiers, took the opportunity for immunity. He starts naming the leaders of the uprising, highlighting Boston as the main reason the insurgents happened in the first place. However, when the judge asks the soldier for last words, Boston rises and adamantly screams, "I am a man," with his hands clenched together. Then the others follow and say they're willing to pay any price for standing up for the race. In the end, Boston, along with other soldiers, is hanged. The movie ends with Downing reading a letter that Boston had written to her, explaining that he needed to stay with his men to protect the future of their race. Thanks for watching.